Several hours had passed since the first German troops made their appearance. Jakob, who was her husband, would surely have left the shop in Josefov by now. The Antiqua was small, just a narrow cavern with a high, ornate ceiling, its facade a door and display window. Hotelier had to believe he'd finished hiding the valuables, shut off the lights, closed and locked up. This meant he was either delayed by the growing crowds of townspeople and Nazis flooding the squares and streets, or that he had been detained. Without further thought, she pulled out a suitcase from the back of their bedroom closet and began to pack. Some shirts of his, underclothing, a pair of flannel trousers, a jacket. His favorite cravat, the black silk one he wore to graduation exercises at engineering school before he left that trade for the shop inherited from his father. For herself, she folded a few dresses, a sweater, toiletries, a pair of lace gloves her mother had passed down to her. Lace gloves, she reflected, wincing, and set them aside. The silly things we cherish. She also packed the photograph of her parents. Her chest was heaving, although no tears filled her eyes. The room reeled as she tried to catch her breath. With effort, she got the overstuffed suitcase closed and buckled its leather straps in place. Then there was the matter of the manuscript. A piano sonata in 3 movements, its staves scored with musical notes in sepia ink by an anonymous hand sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century. It had been her birthright and burden for these 2 decades since her father's death. Birthright because it constituted her father's most treasured bequest to his daughter. Burden because it never failed to remind Hotelier of how the last war stranded her in the world, alone with a child's memories of a man whose mad and maddening words on their last night together had turned her against the thing. Guard it as if it were your own child, he told her when she was still a child herself. One day this will bring you great fortune. I don't want it, she had said, remembering how bitterly her parents argued over the manuscript. Even years later, her mother considered what he had done an outrage, spending 3 months' wages to acquire it. Hotelier's father, like her husband, had always been an aficionado of antique things. But whereas Jakob knew what he was doing, her father, who worked so hard as a musician and instructor and who loved his small collection of old hymnals and early printed music scores, was an easy mark for an unsavory dealer with a trunk full of fake illuminated medieval psalters and supposedly original drafts by famous composers. When Hotelier's mother contracted tuberculosis, he sold off his precious scores for a fraction of what he'd spent on them to pay her medical expenses. The only jewel he kept from his hoard was this one, although he never told his dying wife that he'd hidden it in a corner of the attic, reachable only by a ladder she'd become too weak to climb. In melancholy moments over the years, Hotelier wondered if his manuscript, with its haunted history, ought to be destroyed. What reason did she have to believe it was any more authentic than the rest of her poor delusional father's stash? But sentiment and maybe faith always got the better of her. Besides, her father had personally inscribed it to her at the top of the first leaf in the language of his favorite composers. Engelmusik für meine Engelchen, alles Liebe, Papa. Angel music for my little angel, love, Papa. And still it lay protected in its well-worn satchel. Though reluctantly, she too loved passages of the sonata, remembered how much her father used to adore playing it for her, or singing its sweet, sad melody to her as a bedtime lullaby. Once in a while, despite her resolution, she caught herself humming one of its themes when walking along the river or nodding off to sleep at night. The fact was, she knew the manuscript was probably important. Jakob himself had done some research once. She finally told him about its existence. He had shown it to a pianist friend named Tomasz, who expressed great excitement about the possibilities of its origins. This was several years into their marriage. One would have thought it a dirty secret, the way she had kept the sonata hidden from Jakob for so long. Puzzled but also curious about the manuscript's history, he tried probing Hotelier's girlhood remembrances. Where and how had her father obtained it? What was its provenance? After several outbursts, the likes of which he had never seen from her, Jakob understood that the personal, emotional connection between the document and her father's death finally wasn't his business. so he never delved further into the matter. The artifact itself, however, fascinated, even obsessed him a little. Its fleur-de-lis within a crown shield and the name H. Blum in the watermark, he told Hotelier, suggested that the paper might have been fabricated in Germany or Austria, but it wasn't a watermark he recognized. The brown ink, the stitching holes down the left side of the leaves that indicated it had once been bound, even the pagination in a dark russet crayon from a later period, the more he learned, the more everything about the object only underscored its authenticity. Questions preoccupied him. When was the sonata composed? Where? Was this a copyist's hand or the composer's own? Why had someone set down staves of hastily penned music in yet another hand on the unused paper at the end of the first movement, notes toward what appeared to be a completely different composition? And who had written these three enlightened movements? What an unforgettable evening it had been when Tomáš was finally allowed to perform the piece in his atelier in Mallestrano, on an honest if aging Bösendorfer grand piano, before an audience of a dozen acquaintances, including Hotelier's best friend, Irina, who had long ago urged her to make peace with the manuscript and what it represented. 3 sonatas were performed that night on Sporkovo, a short elbow of the street that curves from the bottom of Janska around to a square where the Lobkowitz Palace stands. The private concert began with the last of Joseph Haydn's piano works, Sonata number 52 in E-flat major, followed by Beethoven's F minor, his audacious first, a work the younger composer dedicated to Haydn, who had been his teacher in Vienna. Both might well have been performed in their own time at the palace down the way. After these came Hotelier's nameless sonata. The mood in the room was uneasy, hopeful, doubtful. Hotelier and Jakub's friends were excited by the chance to hear the mysterious manuscript played. And yet everyone wondered what would drive Tomáš to premiere this untried work in the wake of such obvious glories. It seemed somehow fair to the unknown composer. He performed the first 2 compositions with real panache. Then, after the clapping ceased, he nodded to Jakub, who brought the manuscript to the piano. Tomáš began to play, his friend carefully turning the pages for him. What unfolded in the first movement was energetic and pleasing, if standard and rather Mozartian. The small audience nodded approval when this classic sonata form movement reached its satisfying final chord. What transpired in the second movement, however, was unexpected. Melodious descending scales concluded in lyrical eddies, pools of euphony that defied all laws of spiritual gravity when the waterfall of notes cascaded upward again. The music conveyed joyous esprit that mesmerized its unwary listeners. Then, abrupt as water hitting stone, its rich, poignant tapestries of sound ceased. What followed, without foreshadowing, without warning, was a passage of unspeakable darkness. While Tomáš edged forward through this unsettling soundscape of purest dejection, Hotelier found herself hearing the differences between his execution and the way her father used to play these very notes. As dark as Tomáš painted these musical phrases, her father's interpretation, which she related to her mother's death, was more tragic yet. Fighting back tears, she shifted in her seat through the third movement, a lovely traditional rondo that brought the sonata to its graceful conclusion. Silence hung in the parlor after the last note resounded and died away, but then the reaction was spontaneous and overwhelming. A collective gasp and a sudden burst of applause filled the room. Hobbled as the sonata had been by the fact that its performer was playing the work without benefit of much rehearsal, not to mention the unsympathetic acoustics, it was clear even to the most unmusical ear in attendance that here was something significant. "You absolutely must allow this to be studied and published," Tomáš exclaimed. But Hotelier would have none of it. She refused to say why. Even Irina, who knew that the middle movement was deeply painful for her friend to hear, was unable to persuade her to listen to reason. As trays of wine and beer were brought around, Hotelier Bartosheva thanked Tomáš for his memorable performance. Then, unnoticed, she carefully slid the manuscript back into its satchel, and there it had remained ever since. Thank you.